Witam wszystkie osoby na naszym drugim webinarze SZTAMY. Nazywam się Elena Bielska, jestem prezeską Fundacji Herstory. Nasz drugi webinar jest współorganizowany z Fundacją Ashoka w ramach projektu SZTAMA w edukacji na rzecz zmiany. Projekt realizujemy w programie Aktywni Obywatele Fundusz Krajowy, który jest finansowany z funduszy EOG, czyli Europejskiego Obszaru Gospodarczego. Dzisiejsze spotkanie będzie prowadzić Martyna Rubinowska z Fundacji Ashoka. Natomiast naszym gościem jest Dean Peackok z sieci MenEngage, która zajmuje się włączaniem mężczyzn do działań feministycznych, antyprzemocowych, do takiego sieciowania się na rzecz równych praw dla wszystkich osób. Myślę, że Dean opowie o tym za chwilę więcej. I to tyle wprowadzenia z mojej perspektywy. Wydaje mi się, że Martyna już jest z nami. Tak?
Dzięki.
Okej. Jeśli mogę Ci oddać już głos, to zapraszam. Można zaczynać.
Cześć, I will speak in English, so I switched to English. I will switch the device in the meantime. I have no idea what happened to my computer, but luckily we overcome this difficulty. I am super happy that we will talk today together with Ashoka fellow Dean Peackok. I am Martyna Rubinowska. I work for Ashoka for the last 5 years. I look for people like Dean, so social innovators, social entrepreneurs who are focused to solve social issues in a systemic way. And I am super happy to learn more from you, Dean. And I have a long list of questions, but I know also that you prepare some words for us at the beginning. So maybe I will give floor to you at the very beginning.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me all right? Yeah,
We
great.
hear you loud.
Say it again.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, good. Well, let me start just by saying thank you. It's an enormous honor to have this opportunity to chat with you. I have not yet been to Poland, and so this is the closest I will get to have that experience, especially at the moment given COVID. So really grateful for the opportunity, and just want to thank Lena and Martina for your work, Joanna, your work in making this happen. And I've been an Ashoka Fellow for, goodness, nearly a decade now. I think I became an Ashoka Fellow in 2013. And so, you know, really great to connect with other Ashoka Fellows and the broader Ashoka community and people who are interested in the work of Ashoka. So, you know, wonderful to be here. And I guess I'll just say a few words about myself so that you know how to situate me. And Martina, has a bio been circulated, or should I just...
So we circulated the Ashoka information about you, so the short bio as well, but not that
Okay.
you know, not the conference bio, but you know, Ashoka style information.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll keep it brief. I mean, you know, I'm here today obviously to talk about gender-based violence and efforts to engage men in addressing gender-based violence. And so I'll say I have been doing work to end men's violence really since I was in high school. Here in Cape Town, which is where I speak to you from, and have been doing work to address men's violence really ever since. So I started with an organization called the End Conscription Campaign to oppose the conscription of then white men into the apartheid military. And of course, young men were conscripted to defend a fundamentally unequal and, you know, violent order here in South Africa that entrenched white supremacy and guaranteed, you know, a system of very real violent oppression for Black South Africans here in this country. And so I began to do work with them, organizing other young men in white schools, and predominantly white schools, to oppose conscription. And I didn't think of it as gendered work at that point. I thought of it as anti-apartheid work and anti-racist work. But of course, upon reflection, it was deeply gendered. It was fundamentally about men and masculinities. And so that was kind of the foundation to the work that I have done since. I then worked with homeless and runaway youth in Nicaragua, and then later in San Francisco when I moved to the United States. And I saw there too that the vast majority of young people who were living on the streets were on the streets because of violence that they had experienced in their homes, either violence that they witnessed, their fathers perpetrating against their mothers for the most part, or violence that they themselves experienced, very often at the hands of a man. So I began to then think about this question of, well, how do we address youth homelessness? How do we address it before young people are put on the streets? Because in San Francisco, in the early 1990s, young people were quickly ending up drug addicted, heroin and crystal methamphetamine, and then quite quickly acquiring HIV. And so they acquired HIV. And this, of course, was before the availability of antiretroviral treatment. So I was working with young people who were homeless, drug addicted, HIV positive, and at that point, going to die. And so there was a real urgency to this question of, well, what do we do to stop men's violence? And so I began to volunteer at an organization called Men Overcoming Violence in San Francisco. And I was fortunate because I worked in a homeless shelter at night. And so during the day, I could volunteer at Move. They didn't have a budget for any of the work that I wanted to do. And that work that I wanted to do was to begin to set up a program to work in the schools in San Francisco, working with community members to address the issue of men's violence against women. And I was particularly interested in doing prevention education to change the social norms amongst young people, to decrease their acceptance of violence and to increase young men's commitment to gender equality. So I worked in San Francisco at Move. I established the Men Overcoming Violence Youth Program, which was the first youth program focused on young men on the West Coast, and one of the first in the country, and worked together with a women's rights organization, San Francisco Women Against Rape, to start a high school peer education program in the school districts in San Francisco. And we worked in some of the toughest schools in San Francisco to implement a program we created, which we called STAND, Students Talking About Nonviolent Dating. And we worked with amazing young people, many of them themselves caught up in gang violence or experiencing violence at home. And we trained them to speak to their peers about these issues. Interestingly, at the same time, we started a program for young men who were using violence against their girlfriends, what we called a juvenile battery intervention program. And when I look back on that work, I worry that we, in some ways, did more harm than good for those young men, because we collaborated very closely with the criminal legal system, with the juvenile probation department. And many of those young men then got very caught up in the criminal legal system. They were required to spend a weekend in jail if they didn't show up at the group. And the research that is now available shows very clearly that for young people, and particularly young men, and particularly young men of color, early involvement in the criminal legal system predicts lifelong involvement. And so this is a theme I'll come back to if it's of interest to you all, which is, how do we move beyond a focus on sanctions? How do we move beyond arrest, prosecution, incarceration as our primary strategy? Because in fact, there is little evidence, maybe no evidence, that a harsh criminal legal system response to violence ends the violence or deters it. And so if it doesn't work, what does that mean for us and our commitments to addressing gender-based violence, for ending men's violence against women? But we'll come back to that if it's of interest. And so then I moved to South Africa, and that's going to be the focus of my work, of my presentation here today. And I was very fortunate to join an organization that had begun to develop what was called the Men as Partners Network. And the Men as Partners Network, or the MAP network as we called it, was set up to address two inextricably connected, two directly interrelated phenomena, which was gender-based violence and HIV and AIDS. at the beginning of in the late 1990s, the global community began to be aware of the extent of the problem of HIV and AIDS in Africa. And I'll provide some statistics a little bit later when we talk about South Africa. And quite quickly, people began to realize that women were, in fact, more vulnerable to contracting HIV than men. And this won't be news to you, but a lot of that was because of the relationship between HIV and women's vulnerabilities to contracting HIV. So women who are unable to negotiate the terms of sex, or in fact say no to sex because of men's violence against women, were much more likely to contract HIV. And so there was a very clear association between gender inequality, gender-based violence, and women's HIV vulnerability. So the Men as Partners Network was set up to promote gender equality and reduce women and men's vulnerabilities to HIV. And so I worked doing that work for a handful of years, about 5 years. I set up the office in Johannesburg, moving back from San Francisco at that point. And it was, important work and very good work. But it was work that was fundamentally not political work. And so at the end of 2005, the beginning of 2006, our then deputy president, Jacob Zuma, who went on to become president and is currently in jail, was charged with rape. And he was charged with the rape of a family friend, a woman who in fact was an AIDS activist. And the program that I was directing, which was an international program, didn't allow us to become really politically involved and to call for Jacob Zuma's arrest and prosecution. And so a group of us started another organization called Sonke Gender Justice. And I spent the next 15 years at Sonke, and I'm going to talk a lot about the various different strategies we used at Sonke. When I look back on that work, I left Sonke 2 years ago. I think it's remarkable work, and I worked with incredible people at Sonke. And so I'm going to spend most of my presentation today talking about Sonke. With that said, I currently present to you in my capacity as the director of a multi-country project focused on mobilizing men for peace at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And so that's kind of my trajectory with this work over the last 30 years. But of course, my commitment to this work isn't just because of public health and human rights issues. It's a deeply personal commitment. And so I want to say just a few words about that. I grew up in a family with 5 children, 4 sisters. And, South Africa in the 1970s, 1980s was a very patriarchal place. And in many ways, so was my family. And so grew up in a home where there was never any violence. I never heard any, even any conflict between my parents, but it was a very patriarchal society and a very patriarchal family. And as I began to enter my teen years and I began to think politically, I really began to grapple with this question of why my mother, who was a lawyer, wasn't able to, or was choosing not to work, whereas my father, a doctor, did work and got very kind of particular tension when he came home at the end of the day from work. We would all greet him at the door and my mom would give him a plate of food and a drink. And it was very much like the American TV show, The Brady Bunch, for those of you who've ever watched that. And there was something about it that sat very uncomfortably with me. And so when I was a little bit older, I began to kind of question that and challenge that. Subsequently, a number of my sisters ended up being victims of violence. And so that became another important motivation to do this work. And then I myself was assaulted by men 4 times during my university years, kind of random attacks on the street in Berkeley in California, not a place where one might anticipate that. And so I became really intrigued by violence. I was probably suffering from a mild form of post-traumatic stress disorder. I was very afraid out in the streets. And so I became really focused on this question of violence. What's my potential for violence? What's the potential of violence for people around me? And then I began to work with homeless youth. And so these kind of personal, familial, and professional streams came together in a certain way. And as an activist, I was always thinking about, well, what community can I best work with to advance social justice? What community can I best work with? I had been working with white South Africans in South Africa when I was in the US. I was doing a lot more solidarity work, in solidarity with people in the Middle East and Iraq to try and stop the war there, in Nicaragua to try and stop US military aggression there. And so one day my then partner came home. She was working at a battered women's shelter, and she said she had heard this presentation from this guy, from this organization, Men Overcoming Violence, that I mentioned earlier. And she said, that is a community that you are part of, men. Go and work with those men. And it was this moment that I'm sure many of you can relate to, where a light bulb goes off in your head, where you have a epiphany of sorts. And I thought, yeah, I need to do that. And took a while, like a year before I was able to do that. But that was the third stream. So there was this kind of professional journey, there was a familial journey, and then there was a political journey. And I think the confluence of those different streams was very, very powerful. And I have found the work with men and boys incredibly moving and powerful, working with young men in the schools of San Francisco, working with adult perpetrators of violence in San Francisco, and then coming here to South Africa, coming back home to South Africa. No matter where I've done this work, I have found a very real hunger amongst men for conversations about gender issues, about violence, about the violence that they have experienced, about the limitations and the limits to their relationships, right? And the ways in which patriarchal norms create this very claustrophobic box for men. And most men, no matter where I talk to men, no matter what part of the world, men share a similar experience of feeling pressured to live up to impossible norms, impossible ideas about manhood and masculinities. And so, you know, I have done this act like a man exercise in many countries around the world. And when you ask men, what does it mean to act like a man? Men will quickly fill in a picture that is about being willing to use violence, about not showing emotions, about having stunted relationships, about drinking too much, about not learning to compromise. And so when we present men with that analysis, many men are very quick to say, okay, I in fact haven't thought about it much, but I'm really interested in something different. And so, you know, and that has been my experience in rural areas in South Africa, in, you know, urban centers across the continent, or in San Francisco. And so I think there is something very powerful currently about men's desire for change. Now, I don't want to suggest that that doesn't sit alongside a tremendous resistance amongst other men in countries all over the world. In the United States, we've seen that very, you know, visibly with the Trump administration. In Hungary, certainly you've had your own struggles with that in Poland, and, you know, Brazil, Russia, the list is long, the Philippines, where we've got patriarchal politicians who are resisting change for gender equality. But my experience with most men in most communities is, under the right circumstances, they recognize the ways in which current ideas about manhood are bad for women and they're bad for men. And that gives us tremendous traction to propose change. So let me stop there. I know that's a very long introduction. That's like a 15-minute introduction.
It's a super important introduction.
Over to you, Martina, if you've got anything you want to ask at this point. Otherwise, I can turn to my PowerPoint.
So if you could share at the very beginning, like, what does it mean act like a man for you? What's your answer for this question?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, it's so interesting. We live in a time, right, where gender is being questioned as a construct. And so, you know, in my home, my child is very clear that they identify as gender non-binary. And so the whole conversation about being men and women and existing on a binary in opposition to each other, fortunately, and I think it's something we can all be really grateful for, is being challenged by young people, especially, not just, but especially. And so when I think about what does it mean to be a man, I'm not particularly interested in presenting myself to the world as a man. That's not my goal. And I remember, you know, probably 10, 15 years ago when I came back to South Africa, if I would call sometimes, people would mistake me for a woman. And I would always drop my voice a little bit lower to make sure that I came across as a man. I don't do that anymore. And I feel good that it doesn't matter to me so much whether people view me first and foremost as a man. What I'm invested in being is a social change activist, a social justice activist. And that is my project in life, is to figure out, well, how do we end men's violence? How do we promote democracy? How do we promote health and human rights? How do we end war and conflict? Those are the things that matter to me. Being a man isn't a goal I have, you know, and of course, like everyone else, I am affected by the deluge of media images that we get. And so, you know, I suppose the closest I get to feeling like masculinity is important is being fit. Now, I don't think of that as a gendered quality, right? And I think the world in which we're living is saying, you know, women and men can be fit and strong. And so, you know, for me personally, this question of being a man is not particularly important. I know well what the pressures are, and I know what they were when I was a kid. So I have a strange last name, right? Peacock. And I was teased a lot as a child. My father, you know, and I love my father, he's a great person. At the time, he said to me, look, if anyone teases you, you punch them. And he said, you know, that is the way that you gain respect as a man, as a boy. And so that message about using violence was one I got throughout my childhood. At school, at home, being a man was about not ever being humiliated, not ever showing that you're afraid. It's about being strong and about being tough and about invulnerability, about independence and standing on your own 2 feet. It was all of those things. So don't show any vulnerability, don't show any fear, do show the world that you're strong. And there are consequences if you didn't do that, right? And so I know well what the messages are that men get because I also got them. But I think we've arrived at a point where, at least for some people in some places, those gendered messages have less meaning and less traction, if you like.
Yeah, it would be great to be in this point. I'm not sure that we are there yet. You know,
Yeah.
I am just a mom of 14-month-old child.
Yeah.
And really, gender like definition of this child is part of every conversation that we have at the playground.
Yeah.
So, and because he has curly hairs, you know, everyone is like asking, like, but is it a girl or a boy? And I'm like, yeah, you know, it's a child.
Yeah. No, exactly. And what I'm excited by is, you know, Amber goes to a public school here in Cape Town, and it's, you know, it's in a kind of middle-class suburb, but it's a public school. And Amber is one of many of the kids there who have rejected kind of binary gendered identities. And I think, you know, when people think about South Africa, I don't think they think about gender fluidity. And so I suspect if you went to many urban centers in many countries around the world, TikTok and social media has created a space for kids to think about the world differently and to try on different roles and identities. And I think that's very exciting. There is obviously a backlash to that as well. But I think there are all sorts of exciting, emancipatory possibilities there.
So I think that with this beginning, we can start our conversation. I just would like to encourage everyone here on Zoom, but also those who are watching the streams, to pose the questions. You can write them in Polish or in English, that doesn't matter. And I will use those questions further in our conversation. So you can share the screen.
Great. Yeah, and I would really encourage people to drop questions in the text here. Obviously, I'm not following the Facebook stream, but I'm really interested in your reactions. And if you're interested in moving the conversation in a different direction, please let me know, let us know, so that Martina can put the questions to me. And I assume in the chat they're just in Polish at the moment. But if there's a specific question that I should read,
I will let you know.
Maybe the translators could let me know what that is. Yeah, great. Yep. So I'm going to put up a PowerPoint presentation, and as I said, I've been doing this work for a really long time. I had a hard time figuring out, how do I use 90 minutes? It's such a long time. So I've ended up with a lot of slides, and I may not use them all. And unfortunately, I can't see you other than Martina to know if you are falling asleep. So Martina, you'll let me know if it's going on too many slides. Well, let me move on down. So this is what I'm going to do. Since I'm currently working at WILP, I'm going to just take a moment to tell you about the work we're doing. And then I'm going to move to South Africa and talk about the concrete community-based work we've done in South Africa mostly, although not exclusively. So I currently work at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It is the oldest women's peacebuilding organization in the world, established in 1915 in the middle of the First World War. And in 105 years or 104 years, I am the first man to work there in a programmatic capacity. So it's an incredible honor. And WILP is an amazing organization with country sections in about 50 countries around the world, working with partners. Part of what I love about WILP is they bring this really fabulous root cause analysis to violence and conflict. And so they certainly recognize patriarchy as a significant contributing force to conflict, but they also look at, kind of the war economy. They look at inequalities. They look at colonialism as important drivers of conflict, the nation state system that we sit with, neoliberalism and capitalism, and certainly inequality between women and men. So they bring this great kind of holistic structural analysis. And as I work on this project that I'm going to tell you about, we are relying on those kind of multiple forms of analyses, multiple analyses to make sense of violence and conflict in those places. As I say, the organization works across the world, headquartered in Geneva and in New York, works very closely with the UN system, and works in many countries in Africa, the Middle East especially, but also in Europe. And I'm pretty sure that there is in fact a WILP chapter in Poland. 4 big programs, one focusing on disarmament, another one focusing on the women, peace and security agenda, looking at the range of resolutions that have been put in place within the UN to advance the women, peace and security agenda. And WILP was one of the organizations that kind of conceived of the Security Council Resolution 1325, or conceptualized it, I should say, and has been working very hard to monitor the implementation of the women, peace and security agenda. A crisis response, which is currently happening in a very accelerated fashion around Afghanistan. Our colleagues in the 10,000 members of WILP Afghanistan, many of them scrambling for safety at the moment, and a number of WILP members there have been assassinated. And so crisis response an important part of the work, and then a strong focus on human rights. And the picture you see there is, of course, the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and we use the human rights mechanisms within the UN a lot to advance violence prevention and peace. The initiative that I lead is this one, countering, I like to say countering, not confronting militarized masculinities, and mobilizing men for feminist peace. And we use research, we use alliance building and advocacy, and we do those things in a manner that is accountable to women's rights organizations. And I realize as I say that I haven't included a strong focus on accountability in my presentation, but a core principle of any of the work that's happening, you know, any sort of progressive gender equality work with men and boys, a core principle is that it must be accountable to women's rights organizations. It must be in dialogue with, follow the priorities established by women's rights organizations. And that doesn't mean, you know, organizations that work with men don't bring their own perspectives to the questions of men's violence, but there must be very real dialogue. And if that's of interest, I can talk to you about how we made that principle real in our work at Sonke Gender Justice. I think I'm going to skip over most of what's in this slide here, but just to say the work with men and boys to end men's violence and to advance gender equality is not new work. So yeah, so just to say the work with men and boys for gender equality has been happening around the world really since the late 1970s, and initially in the US and Europe. Now, of course, there are incredibly powerful examples of individual men who spoke out for gender equality much earlier than that. But kind of in an organized fashion connected to a broader human rights and social justice agenda, particularly in the US, connected to the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement. And then in South Africa, we see this picture that you see there on your left is from the End Conscription campaign, and it reads, man, didn't they tell you the military makes you mad, as in crazy. So that's the End Conscription campaign that I was telling you about earlier. The picture to your right, you'll recognize the man on the extreme right, Nelson Mandela. This is the first national men's march against men's violence against women, held in 1998. The man standing next to him, you may also know Kumi Naidoo. He became the General Secretary of Amnesty International and Greenpeace, and an incredible South African activist generally. The other piece that I didn't mention to you earlier on, if we just go back a sec, is the MenEngage Alliance was established in 2005. I'm one of the co-founders of the MenEngage Alliance together with Gary Barker and a number of other people. But the MenEngage Alliance really has taken off in ways that none of us could have imagined. It's now active in 70 countries around the world, formally constituted country networks made up of dozens of organizations in 50 countries around the world. And in many places where I think in the popular imagination, we wouldn't think there were organizations working with men for gender equality. Rwanda, Mongolia, Cambodia, South Africa, Mexico. So in Africa, there are, I think, 25 MenEngage country networks. In Latin America, they're in most of the countries there as well. So it's a global network that has really taken off, and certainly exists in Europe and parts of Eastern Europe as well, quite strong in the Balkans. And they've been dealing a lot with this question of how do you work with men and boys, how do you mobilize men in a time of growing populism and kind of patriarchal politics. So just to say, that's kind of this trajectory that my work has been connected to and a part of. Next slide, please, Joanna. In South Africa, I mentioned the Men as Partners program, the Brothers for Life campaign, and the One Man Can campaign were big campaigns that kind of shaped the work with men and boys in South Africa. That mural that you see at the bottom, we painted near a big bus terminal in downtown Johannesburg. And we painted hundreds of murals like that across the country. What was interesting about that particular one was a group of graffiti artists came, and at the far left, I don't have that picture here, it was obviously a group of women. They painted with a similar outline and silhouette a group of women saying, "One woman can." And so these murals provoked an interesting debate, which was great. Let's move to the next slide. What I'm going to do now is focus on what we know about men's violence. And I'm going to use South Africa as an example, but then I will step back a little bit and talk about the research findings globally. And here I'm drawing on my role at the University of Cape Town in the School of Public Health and some of the research that I've done at Sonke. So I'm going to focus on some research we did at Sonke in 2015. But I will also in a moment reference some other data from South Africa. So next slide, please. So the research I'm going to describe is part of what was called the Sonke Change Trial. And it was a collaboration between Sonke Gender Justice and the University of Witwatersrand, the main academic university in Johannesburg. And it was funded by the British government as part of their What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women initiative. And they funded about 20 different interventions across the world and made sure that there was rigorous evaluation happening over a multi-year period. So this is what we learned about men's violence in a community called Diepsloot. It's a big informal settlement, about 250,000 people, mostly living in a shanty town. And so, of course, it is the research is specific to that place, but it is generalizable to many other communities like it in Johannesburg and in South Africa. So next slide, please. So we spoke to men between 18 and 40, most of them living in a shack, and most of them unemployed, many of them never employed. And what we learned was that just over half of the men said that they had used violence against women in the last 12 months. Either they had raped a woman, or they had beaten a woman, or they had done both. And in some instances, they'd done it multiple times. So you see there, about a third of the men had used both physical and sexual violence. And a majority of the men used violence multiple times. So a majority of this slim majority of the men. So next slide.
And how did you ask this question to get this answer? Because I saw this result and I was not only shocked by a number, which is of course shocking, but also how it happened that those people that you asked were, open enough to admit.
No, it's a very important question. I mean, the nuts and bolts is we surveyed 2,600 men and we asked them these questions and we gave them a tablet so that they were answering themselves. So some of the shame involved in asking someone directly was diminished. But the fact that people were willing to talk about it, I think also reflects the ways in which it's normalized. So, violence against women in many parts of South Africa is not an uncommon experience. And so, unfortunately, perhaps people are willing to acknowledge that they've used violence because it's not seen as socially stigmatized as it might be in other places. I think that is beginning to change. But yeah, so that's the answer to your question.
Okay.
Yeah. Next slide, please.
Sorry, it's stuck.
Aha, there we go. So we asked a set of questions about men's beliefs about gender, about being men and about being women and about men's relationships to women. And what we saw was that there were very widespread patriarchal norms. A third of the men believed that if a man had paid bride price, what we call lobola in South Africa, it meant that he effectively owned the woman. So if he paid dowry, just over 3/4 of the men held sexually entitled views, and about the same believed that it was appropriate for men to control women's clothes, their friends, their movements, And we saw an association also between men who had many sexual partners in the last year, and an association between men who had paid for sex in the last year and their use of violence. So next slide. What we saw was that men who held these gender inequitable views were 50% more likely to use violence than those men who didn't. Men who held sexually entitled views, just a little bit more likely still. The controlling behaviors, they were twice as likely. Men who had 7 or more partners in the last year, 2.5 times, and men who had paid for sex in the last year, 3 times more likely. That last one is something we can come back to if people are interested, because I think there's a risk that that comes across as a anti-sex work piece of data. And in South Africa, the position of progressive organizations is very, very clear, that the law must allow people to sell sex, and that it should be decriminalized. And that's a position that Sonke has supported. So we can come back to that if people have questions. I think that's different in different parts of Europe, and I think it's a generational issue as well. Next slide. And this is really one of the points I wanted to get to, is a lot of the work with men and boys in schools and community settings focuses on changing those norms we just saw a moment ago, focuses on changing men's ideas about manhood, men's ideas about their relationship to women. And I think that work is critically important, and we saw that in the data, that if you want to end men's violence, you must challenge those ideas that grant men a sense of entitlement to women's bodies, that give men a sense of permission to try and control women's movements and lives. But it's not just about norms. And I think the implications of these findings, which I will talk about in a sec, are ignored by too many people doing work to address violence. That in fact, violence is driven by a number of predictable social circumstances as well. So in this community, hunger is widespread. Many people eat 1 meal a day, and sometimes less. Not surprisingly, household hunger was also predictive of men's violence against women. And I think we can understand how that would be, right? In English, there's this term people use, hangry, a combination of hungry and angry.
We have it working in Polish as well.
Okay, yeah. And I think we all know that intuitively. When we're hungry, we're ratty, we're irritable. So we saw the manifestation of that in Deep Sloat. Household hunger meant men were twice as likely to use violence against women. People who had insufficient family resources to take care of themselves, people who needed to borrow or steal to get the kind of necessities, were also 2 times more likely. So people in destitute poverty. And then some other things that I think we kind of know, but that we don't pay a lot of attention to in a lot of the violence prevention work we do. Where communities are saturated with alcohol, and this is true of poor communities around the world, that the alcohol industry targets those communities. And in South Africa, they allow a proliferation of illegal outlets, right? So these are outlets that are not licensed, and that stay open well beyond the legal hour. They're open well before the legal hour. They sell to children, and they allow people to drink to the point of being absolutely intoxicated. So alcohol, also predictive of violence. Trauma, 2.5 times, association with violence. Depression, 3 times. And then this question of exposure to violence as a child. So 5 times more likely for men who had witnessed violence or who had experienced violence in the home. And so the question I would put to you is, if we know this, if we know that experiencing childhood abuse is in fact twice as predictive as sexually entitled or attitudes about sexual entitlement, what are we doing about that? What do we as violence prevention practitioners do to address trauma, to address childhood abuse as a critical way to interrupt violence? How do we interrupt these intergenerational cycles of violence where someone witnesses violence as a child, they tell themselves they're never going to use the violence that they witnessed and been horrified by, and then they do. And I worked with hundreds of those men in San Francisco, men who, when I interviewed them on the intake process, would say, I know better than anyone how destructive violence is because I experienced it and I watched it. And I told myself I would never be that man, and now I am, they would say. And so we provide, in some countries, in some places, those kinds of group counseling approaches, but our prevention work doesn't usually address these things. Our prevention work is very focused on norms and ideas.
Yeah, so what you said, those predictors are not only predictors, but like root causes of what is happening. So somehow we will not solve the issue that we try to solve if we do not also focus on those.
Exactly. So in South Africa, the laws are really clear around around alcohol and the sale of alcohol. We've got great laws, but we've got almost no people there. Liquor board is supposed to monitor the implementation of the laws, and they don't, because they don't have enough staff. And no one, not no one, but not enough people are saying, let's fix that so that we can shut down these illegal outlets and make sure that these communities are not saturated with alcohol. Similarly, if you try and find a counselor in South Africa in local communities, you're not going to find them. We hosted UNESCO, the UN agency in Cape Town, a few years back, and we took the UNESCO delegates to a local high school in one of the most violence-affected neighborhoods. And the principal told the story of kids experiencing violence at home, experiencing violence on their way to school, experiencing or witnessing violence at school, and then in reverse every day. And one of the delegates from the UN said, well, how many counselors do you have here to help those children deal with this problem of trauma and violence? And she laughed, the principal. And she said, well, we share one counselor with 50 other schools. Now,
50.
So,
okay.
Roughly that's one counselor for every 50,000 students. And so the provision of mental health and psychosocial support, impossible under those circumstances. If I was that counselor, I wouldn't show up for work, right? How do you deal with your own vicarious traumatization? So there's a real question for us invested in violence prevention, which is, how do we insist that those systems are in place? How do we make sure that there's a basic income grant so that families have enough money to put food on the table? How do we make sure that schools and communities have access to psychosocial support? How do we make sure that communities have access to recreational facilities for young people so that young people can go out and exercise and do things that we know are protective against violence? And on that, it's not something we asked about, but Diepsloot is a kind of classic example of a degraded urban environment. There's very little vegetation, lots of trash. And so what do we do with what we know to be true about the relationship between the built environment and violence, where people live in conditions that confront them day to day with the reality that their lives don't have dignity? They're more likely to use violence. And a simple study done in the US where they increased urban parks and urban green spaces, they saw a dramatic decline in violence. And so for me at this stage in my career, this stage in my kind of professional trajectory, I'm really interested in some of these structural questions, because I think our group work, and I've done it for years and years, and I think it's really valuable, must be combined with attention to some of these broader structural forces. So I'm going to turn, if I can, to how we tried to do that at Sonke. And I'm going to hurry a little bit so that we've got time for questions. Next slide, please, Joanna. Yeah, I don't need to go over this. The newspapers picked up on our study and there was a lot of media attention. This is from one of the main news outlets in South Africa. Next slide. So yeah, got a huge problem. Next slide. But I think, in South Africa in particular, but certainly in other places, we focus very much on risk. And I think we have to ask the question of potential. We talk about young men being at risk, but I think we do a disservice if we don't say they're also at potential for being change agents themselves, for rejecting the violence that they have witnessed, and for embracing a commitment to nonviolence. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I'm going to focus on Sonke, and I'm going to show you a few images that hopefully bring the work to life, and I'm going to show you 2 short clips. Next slide. Just a word about South Africa. South Africa is a place where it is easy to do human rights work. So what we can do in South Africa in terms of holding government officials to account is very different than what you can do perhaps in Poland, certainly in other countries in Africa. There is a culture here of claiming rights, demanding government implementation, and we've got a constitution that facilitates that. So when people were dying of AIDS in the early 2000s, they said, look, Section 27 of the Constitution makes it really, really clear that everyone has the right to health. And the Constitutional Court ruled and forced the government to roll out antiretroviral treatment. And you can see there are a number of sections of the Constitution that make violence prevention work legally accessible to you. We've got both good laws and then we've got good structures. So we've got an equality court where you can take politicians and you can charge them with undermining gender equality, and we've done that, and I'll talk about that. But the broader point is South Africa's new constitutional democracy is a very exciting place to do violence prevention work. Next slide. I don't need to say more about this. The study I just spoke about gives you context, but an earlier nationally representative sample was similarly frightening in its implications. It wasn't as bad as the Deep Throat study, but we saw half of men saying that they had beaten a partner, a third of men saying that they'd raped a partner, even though it was much less over their life cycle. Almost a third of women in South Africa saying that they had a coerced first sexual experience, and very high levels of violence against LGBT community members. Here, next slide, please. In terms of HIV, I just want to lay out the context because it's important for the work I'm going to describe. South Africa's population of 60 million, fully 7.7 million people living with HIV, by far the largest number globally. And amongst adults, it's essentially 1 in 5, in some communities 1 in 2. So HIV is a massive problem. In the communities in which we were working, HIV prevalence was very high, 30–40% in many communities. And as I've said before, particular vulnerabilities to HIV acquisition amongst young women. Importantly, South Africa has now, this is an old slide, nearly 6 million people on treatment, and that is government funded. It is an enormous accomplishment, but it reflects hard-won battles by civil society organizations, particularly the Treatment Action Campaign. And Sonke's work is modeled after the Treatment Action Campaign. So I want to acknowledge the work that they did because it served as an inspiration to all of us. Next slide, please. We're going to skip this one. Next slide. So Sonke, in the context of South Africa, our focus, rights, action, and accountability. And a very strong component of that was mobilizing men for gender equality and working with men to address gender-based violence. But Sonke worked with women and men together, and that was part of our commitment to accountability. Next slide. So you'll see, I'll just focus on the vision, very directly connected to the democratic project in South Africa. Our vision was a world in which men, women, and children can enjoy equitable, healthy, and happy relationships that contribute to the development of just and democratic society. So we said, look, relationships are the building block of democracy. If you have fundamentally anti-democratic families, you have a hard time building democracy in society. Next slide. So a strong focus in South Africa, but we worked in 25 countries across the continent, particularly through the MenEngage Alliance. Next slide. There are two great films about Sonke. That one can't just fold your arms. If you're interested in watching it to understand the work, you can find it on the Sonke website. You can Google it. And it tells the story of our efforts to hold a very prominent political leader accountable for statements he made that we thought undermined our constitutional commitment to gender equality. We took him to the Equality Court, and the process took a year. But what was important about it, and it was deliberate on our part, was that every time we went to court, there was saturated national media coverage about Sonke's work to hold Julius Malema accountable. And we won that case, and he was forced to make an apology on national television for comments he made that we thought represented hate speech against women. And the judge ruled in our favor. He went on national television and issued a formal apology, and then was also instructed to pay 50,000 Rand, which is about $5,000 at this point, to a battered women's shelter. And he refused to do that. So we sent the sheriffs, the police essentially, into his house, and we took possession of some of his furniture that we believed was to the amount of $5,000. And he then gave the money, and we gave him his furniture back. But it's an example of the ways in which civil society organizations directly try and hold political leaders accountable, both because of the conversation that it generates nationally and because of the symbolic value of doing so. And I can talk more about that if you're interested. Next slide, please. So Sonke uses 5 strategies, 6 really, if you include the kind of organizational development. The first is community education and mobilization, and I'm going to talk about that at some length. Second is policy development, and that is policy that's focused on developing, for instance, a new national action plan to address gender-based violence, which we won very recently. And when either the government or the private sector doesn't act in accordance with their obligations, we have used strategic litigation. We have sued, and for instance, on the issue of prison crowding, we thought that and believe that overcrowding of prisons meant that prisons were incubators of violence, that the prisons generated violence. And so we sued the national government to address chronic prison overcrowding, and we won that. We sued government to extend parental leave for women and also for men and for same-sex couples. We won that. We sued the government to insist on a full ban on corporal punishment so that it became illegal to hit children, and we won that. So we used the strategic litigation quite a lot. And then we did a lot of communications work, many shows on public radio, community radio, and we produced our own documentaries and short films to support some of our advocacy work. A really key component was this building of coalitions and networks. So any issue we worked on, whether it was our prisons work, our demand for a national action plan on gender-based violence, we set up a coalition of national actors so that we could find greater strength in numbers and push together for those changes. And that was probably the most important strategy we used. And then we always paid very close attention to research. So research before we did anything to understand what was going on, and then monitoring and evaluation to look at whether we had achieved anything. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus now on that first piece, which I think is the piece that's of most interest to participants here, which is the piece around community education and community mobilization. And we used 3 big campaigns: the One Man Can campaign, the Brothers for Life campaign, and the Men Care campaign. And I'll talk about each of those next. Next slide. No worries. So yeah, as I mentioned, extensive formative research to develop any campaign. The logo of the campaign, we tested on the streets. We interviewed about 1,000 men to understand their attitudes towards gender equality. We asked them, did they think violence against women was a problem? Did they think they were doing enough to address it? And did they think government was doing enough? And then we asked them what they would do, what they wanted to see an organization do. And we then shared those survey findings with women's rights organizations, and we shared our ideas about a campaign with them. So that was the formative research. Next slide. And we developed a series of easy to use community tools. So fact sheets that were translated in all 9 of South Africa's official languages, and for different constituencies. So the first one on the left was for faith communities. How can men in faith communities challenge gender-based violence? The other one that you see on the far right was for coaches. There were a few others for fathers, for men in relationships with women who had experienced violence. And we developed a whole series of materials, posters, t-shirts, buttons, a DVD that we used in the bus system in and out of the city every morning, songs, traditional songs about men singing about gender equality, about violence. Next slide. And the workshops that we ran were always a starting point for community mobilization and activism. So it would be a 2 or a 4-day workshop focused on, gender equality, on HIV, on gender-based violence, and then on community mobilization. And the idea was that this mix of community events, murals, workshops, the face-to-face peer education would then lead to the establishment of community action teams. And those community action teams would work in their local communities to identify issues that they wanted to take on, and they took those forward. That might have been HIV focused, it might have been alcohol related, it could have been dealing with a particular incident of violence. Next slide. And this is an example of a community action team in a rural community, Bushbuck Ridge, up near the Mozambican border. And you can see the guy there with his loudhailer, and they were participating in a demonstration. And at that demonstration, you can see these little blue packs. Those are bags of condoms that they were handing out. And so lots of these demonstrations in response to local events. All of those people would have gone through an extensive workshop and community education process themselves. Next slide. These are an example of murals that we promoted, that we worked, and again, it would be community action teams that would do these. The one on the bottom right was in response to xenophobic violence, and it's an example of the kind of intersectional approach we took to say, in South Africa, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable are often refugees and migrants. How do we make sure that their rights are also respected and that community members speak up against violence against immigrants? Next slide. And we did lots of evaluations to assess the impact. And I'm glad to say that we were able to show significant impact, significant reductions in men's use of violence, significant increases in men's use of HIV services, and very clear examples of success. Not on every instance. Some of the evaluations were disappointing and they didn't show much change. But the point I wanted to make here is we took evaluation very seriously. Next slide, please. This is the Brothers for Life campaign. The Brothers for Life campaign, unlike the One Man Can campaign, was a big mass media campaign. It also had an on-the-ground mobilization component. But I'm going to show you 2 clips. The first one, Joanna, is the manifesto clip. So it's the one that says there is a new man in South Africa. And this was aired, this campaign was launched right before the World Cup was hosted in South Africa. And it was funded by the US government, amongst others. And so there was a lot of money behind it. We ran these ads during the halftime of all of the soccer games during World Cup. This one that you're going to see, and others. In fact, before we do that, just next slide, I think I've got a picture of some of the materials that we, no, so this is actually the rugby team that won the World Cup rugby. But we had a number of very well-known international soccer players as Brothers for Life spokespeople as well. Whoops, go back. So the Men Care campaign was a third dimension to our work, and it's very much focused on increasing men's involvement in active, non-violent parenting, and it takes very seriously this notion of men being at potential. The research is really clear that men who are involved in the lives of their children early on are themselves less likely to use violence and are more likely to remain involved in the lives of their children. So in South Africa, I'm sure like in Poland, there is a real gap in terms of men's involvement in care work, whether that's care for children, care for elderly people. And so this was a campaign to say, by bringing men into their families more and by encouraging men and educating men about care work, we can simultaneously decrease the burden on women of carrying that care work, increase women's ability to enter the labor market and to live less stressed lives, and encourage men to be less violent and more involved in important care work, and in that way begin to shift social norms about masculinities as well. And so you'll see we used three broad campaigns, three broad strategies at the community level, a lot of the same kind of public education work. The service delivery level, we trained service providers, social workers, hundreds of, in fact, thousands of social workers across the country. And then we engaged in policy advocacy to change some of the national parenting leave policies. And we worked with the trade unions as an important partner to increase parental leave for everyone, as I said earlier. And we, for the first time ever, established parental leave for fathers. There had previously been, I think, a very problematic situation where women were granted 4 months and men were granted none. And I think the message that was sent was very clear. It's women's job to take care of children, especially newborns, and men not so much. And so we pushed for that change so that we could begin to change the narrative around men's roles in family life. And that was just in South Africa, but we also, through the Global Men Care campaign, which is active in about 40, 50 countries around the world as well, have pushed for what we call the Men Care Pledge, which includes a range of different issues related to violence prevention, the expansion of parental leave, and the use of social protection programs to improve the well-being of children. Next slide, please.
And can I maybe ask you here, because it is one of the questions that someone posted, that when you communicate it, how do you communicate it in the way that men hear it as an opportunity also for them? Like it's a win-win solution, not, you know, now I need to, I don't know, earn money for the family and, you know, clean dishes. As I see in this picture.
No, sure. So some of it is what I was describing earlier, and that is by helping men think about the sometimes unspoken and unacknowledged costs to men of patriarchal norms. So I remember giving a presentation at the OSCE in Vienna a few years ago, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and it was to their ambassadors, and we were talking about violence prevention. But the minute I shifted the focus to parenting, the kind of resistance that I had experienced from them, this kind of sitting back in their chairs, changed. And they talked about the costs to them as fathers and the anguish that they experienced of not being available to their children because they were expected to work all the time. And so that's part of why we came in with this focus on fatherhood, was to say, most men aspire to be good parents. There's often a gap between aspiration and practice. But there are many men, including many very poor men, many men who are working multiple jobs, who wish they could spend more time with their kids. And so we can say, it's not just your fault, and it's not just the fault of your employer. It is a social problem that there's no parental leave available for men. There's not enough available for women. There's little in the way of social protection programs to fund childcare and those sorts of things. And so as men join with women to make changes that allow you to be more connected to your family. And so it's often about finding the entry point. You know, with the men that I worked with at MOVE, at Men Overcoming Violence, an opening was to say, what was it like to grow up in a home where there was violence? What do you remember about that? And the men would say, I was terrified. I would hear my father coming home and I would be terrified. What does it feel like to be the man who your children are afraid of? Well, it feels terrible. And so it's about sometimes finding an opening now and it varies from group to group. For men who are politically more progressive, who are more self-conscious about social justice issues, you can have a conversation about solidarity. What does it mean to you as a man to be progressive but not speak out for gender equality? How does gender equality become part of your politics? And we're doing that in conflict zones to say, you're a man who's active in efforts to achieve peace, but where does gender equality sit in your struggles for change? And so I quite honestly think a lot of it is in the framing and the tone, the pitch. I heard someone say the greatest predictor, he asked the group, he said, what do you think the greatest predictor of a man's involvement in workplace gender equality initiatives is? This was a UN Women meeting. And the participants, they provided a range of answers. And he said, well, the greatest predictor of a man's involvement in gender equality work is an invitation. And, I think some of the room, it was mostly UN women activists, were a little bit skeptical. But in my experience, there's a lot of truth to that. So that's why if you look at our campaign names, it's not one man shouldn't use violence. It's one man can. It's not brothers against violence. It's brothers for life. It's men care, not men stop not doing the dishes, right? And
do you have some, I don't know, clue or how to find this entry point, this opening point? Because there's, from what I hear, there's a lot of insight. So being in the shoes of those people, but maybe how do you do that? How do you define this entry point to invite them to the conversation? Because I guess it is the hardest point, and to work with any community, how to invite them to sit across the table.
Yeah, so I think it depends on the strategy you're using, right? So for mass media campaigns and community media campaigns, you're going to do survey work, you're going to do polls, focus group discussions. When I worked for an organization called Futures Without Violence in San Francisco, we ran a series of focus group discussions with men in communities across the country. And we asked them, what's the thing you are willing to do? And most of the men thought, well, when it comes to violence, what I should do is confront a perpetrator. I should assault him or beat him up or something. We were like, no, let's not go there. And of course, that's too scary for most people to consider anyway. A, it's not useful, and B, it's too scary. And so we said, well, what is it you're prepared to do? And the men said, well, we're prepared to talk to our kids, and particularly we're prepared to talk to our sons. So that insight led us to a campaign that was coaching boys into men. And the idea was talk early, talk often to your sons about gender equality. And we gave them concrete messages. If you're doing community education work, then it's really important to do that kind of formative research I was describing earlier. But for community education, obviously, what works best is an experiential popular education methodology, where you're not telling people to change, but exploring their reality with them and asking them to assess how they find that reality, and if there are things they want to change, to strategize together with them about how they might change that. So that's the whole Paulo Freirean approach to popular education, right? Reflect on your reality, consider change, identify the strategies for change. And that happens in dialogue with community members, and it happens best when that dialogue is between trusted community members. And so I was usually not the person who ran workshops in South Africa because I'm not the right person to. And so I think that, part of how you figure it out is, well, you're from those communities. And so you know better what might work and what doesn't. But let me just make a concluding remark. I'm not going to go through the rest of the slides. I think let me see if there's anything else that's critically important. Oh yeah, one more thing to say. In addition, so if we want to deal with these structural forces that I was mentioning earlier, and if we want to do effective community education, and most importantly, if we want to prevent violence, I think what we're seeing from communities across the world is the most effective way to do that is to work in a multi-sectoral way. So you bring together the key stakeholders in a local community. And there's a group in Oakland, California called the Prevention Institute, where I had the very good fortune to do my internship when I was a graduate student. And Prevention Institute are phenomenal, and I would encourage you to look at their website. They have really pioneered these multi-sectoral approaches to violence, where you bring together the people responsible for employment. You bring the local businesses together. You bring the people who are responsible for zoning laws so that you deal with illegal liquor outlets or outlet density. You bring together the parks and recreation people, the schools, the childcare providers, and together you strategize about solutions. And that is, I think, emerging as the most powerful way to do this work. And that's what we started to do at Sonke in rural communities. We established rural stakeholder forums, and we brought people together to say, what's the problem with violence in your community and who needs to be involved to address it? So that we didn't put the burden on the people who showed up for workshops. And sometimes the people who showed up for workshops were the people with the least social power. They showed because they weren't working. They showed because they wanted the food we were distributing at lunchtime. And so we then really began to think about how do you put in place a multi-stakeholder approach that brings all of the key actors together. And for those of you who are doing community education work, it can be hard to kind of get your head out of the water enough to start thinking about, well, who are the other actors that need to be involved here? And when I worked at Mission High School in San Francisco, we didn't do that. We just worked with those young people. And we asked them to change their environment, but we didn't do anything with the people who had the power to change that environment. And so I think this kind of multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder way really is important to supplement the good and important work we do with small groups and with individuals. And so that's what Sonke is doing a lot of at the moment. And it's, you know, thinking about the policy environment, thinking about multi-stakeholders, thinking about media. It's using that broad set of communities, that broad set of change strategies that I think ultimately produces change at a scale that makes a difference. Because that, after all, is what we're trying to do, is not just change individuals, but change societies so that violence becomes unacceptable and that men champion gender equality. So I'll stop there, and I hope some of this is useful, and love to hear the questions that are surfacing in the chat.
Yeah, it's extremely useful. And the one question, I guess, is from the chat is very connected, because you mentioned those stakeholder forums and the multi-stakeholder approach. And our educational system, are schools part of that? Do you work with teachers, or how do you work?
Yes, absolutely. Now, I would say Sonke didn't do enough work with schools. The multi-stakeholder approach we started using in the Eastern Cape was an example where we did try and do that, working particularly with the Department of Education. But we never established a strong expertise for working in schools. And partly that was because schools are very hard to get into in South Africa. And so I can share some insights, but I don't want to pretend to be an expert on working in schools.
Okay. So I guess the next question, which is also connected to the topic that we discussed before, so how to engage men in the first, there's a question about how to invite the first men in the communities, in the local communities, to cooperation. So, you know, how to, there is a theory of change with a pencil. So, you know, how to find those sharp-ended people that we can, you know, start with the graphite of the pencil.
Yeah. I mean, we worked through progressive organizations. So we would pull together a meeting. We would, you know, convene a meeting at the community level to bring together people who are interested in addressing these issues. And in most communities, there is a battered women shelter. Those people can help identify the men who are supporting them, and we bring those people together. There are, of course, more formal methodologies for identifying informal leaders. And Suzanne Maman at the University of North Carolina has done some really important work to identify not the formal leaders, but the informal leaders, the people who in fact change things at the local level. And so some of those methodologies are out there. We didn't use them very much. We did it more by convening a dialogue in a local community and then inviting people to participate and working with those people who did step forward. Often also engaging, you know, existing structures, traditional leaders, religious leaders, youth groups, LGBTQ groups, and partnering with them.
But when you have, for example, like I know it from one of those videos that you guys unfortunately couldn't see now, but when you have those fathers group, like it's I guess it's, you know, the similar question here, because I think that because of also this question, but because of the experience of many, you know, Ashika fellows and the social activists that I know, that, you know, the hardest part is to reach to them. So that's why I dig to know how you try, you know, how do you invite those men to be part of those groups, to because I am sure that magic happens during those, you know, like conversations in the circle, but it's so hard to sit at first.
You know, interestingly not though. And I think that's because we often went through existing structures. We would say, you know, who wants to get together to talk about their family life? And we worked with groups that were doing work on family issues in local communities. And so we didn't find it difficult. Now, it's very different in a context like South Africa, where you've got 40% unemployment, right? And in some communities, 60, 70% unemployment. So people have a lot more time on their hands, and people are also eager to benefit from a lunch that you might provide during a workshop, or a, you know, even tea and coffee after a meeting. So that does facilitate it in a different way than if you're trying to do something after a busy week on a weekend. But my experience is, you know, and it connects with what the guy asked at the UN Women meeting. Like, I think, you know, about the most powerful thing you can do is invite people. And in my experience, people show up, even people who you would think are really opposed. And sometimes in that discussion, they maintain their opposition. I remember working with a man, he said, look, I am a proud Zulu man. He said, what you're saying makes sense to me, but I'm going to have to figure out what I do with my cultural identity that is at odds with some of the things you're saying. And then, you know, later he was like, look, you know, I'm going to have to challenge my cultural beliefs, because what we've been discussing here is powerful. And so there's an openness beyond what I would often have expected.
Wow. It's like, it's really impressive, and I'm not sure, like, maybe you can also react in a chat, because like I'm really shocked hearing it, because from you know what we hear right now from the political leaders and, you know, people who speak in media and here in Poland, it's not this message, unfortunately, right now.
No, and I think, just very quickly on that, I think the issue of context is massive. You know, in South Africa, politicians speak all the time about their commitment to ending men's violence against women and about gender equality. There's a massive disconnect between the rhetoric and the action. Whereas in other places, there isn't even the rhetoric, right? There's opposing rhetoric. So I get that. And that's why South Africa is an exciting place to do this work.
So there's maybe a last question from those that we got. I'm not sure that I fully understand it. It's written in English, so I will just read it. What advice will you give someone who wants to run as related a project in an environment not as friendly in terms of how men see violence and the constitution as that of South Africa?
Yeah, and there's a first part to that question, right, which is, do you involve women in your team? And if so, what's the approach of the men towards the women? So if I can, let me speak to that because at Sonke we had, you know, by the time I left Sonke was about 60-70% women. And even at Men Overcoming Violence, where we were running groups for men who had been arrested for domestic violence, we had women and men running those groups together. And so it was really important to model gender equality in the facilitation team. And, you know, I think while men didn't want to talk about some things in front of women, they didn't want to talk about some things in front of men. And so women were able to go places that sometimes were harder for men to ask. And I think, you know, in South Africa, we'd often hear this notion of like men don't want to talk with women, they want to talk with men. But when women co-facilitated, if they were good, you know, in the same way that if the men were good, they had great conversations. I remember Nontlantla, who worked on our taxi project. So taxis in South Africa are the minivans that transport 16 million people, 26 million people every day in and out of the cities. And most, like 99% of those minivans are driven by men. So we did work to try and end sexual harassment and men's violence in the taxi industry. And Nontlantla, who's a middle-aged woman, showed up to one of the leadership meetings of the Taxi Association. And she said, you know, I'm here to talk with you. And they said, well, we won't talk to you, you're a woman. And she said, well, fine, you can leave. I came here to talk. And, you know, if you don't want to talk to me, you can leave. And they were like, no, but this is our space. And she said, fine, but I've come here to talk and I'm not leaving. And by the end of that session, she had won them over. So not only did she work with them, but she worked very effectively with them. Now, of course, that's a challenging thing to do, to face down a room full of hostile men. But my point is, I think it's about the facilitation skills often. And we can work with people to build those. In terms of the advice to give to someone who's working in a more difficult environment, I mean, I think we covered some of that ground just a moment ago, Martina, in response to your question.
But I have but is it really South Africa so nice environment to work with? That's why I had a problem to understand this question, because, you know, it's still very hard to place to work and to have this work done, isn't it?
No, I mean, that's not to say when you run workshops or when you hold discussions in South Africa that you don't run into opposition. Of course you do. But the question of convening people is not difficult. And maybe it's because of our anti-apartheid history. There's a very, and I think it is different. Like, you know, when I've done quite a bit of work in Vienna and talking with people in parts of Europe, there just isn't that robust civil society movement that there is in South Africa. And so in South Africa, part of how the apartheid government was overthrown was by establishing street committees, block committees, neighborhood committees. And so there is a very rich collection of organizations working in local communities, and you work through those. Whereas I think in more, you know, in Europe and North America, that doesn't exist as much. You may have a neighborhood watch, but you don't have a church association. In South Africa, we have clubs, people get together to discuss TV shows they've watched, or clubs of supporters for soccer teams. And then certainly you have those in Europe too. So we work through those a lot. But it's also about finding people who have legitimacy in their local communities. And, you know, as I say, that selection process is really important. I never spoke to traditional communities in South Africa. It's just not something I can do. Thank
you very much, Dean. It is, you know, big part of inspiration, knowledge. I'm really inspired how you collect data and how you also make use of research. Like I'm personally very inspired by that. And having in mind, like the context being so far and so close to each other, it's really amazing. I also would like to thank very much three person who make this meeting possible for everyone to understand. So Maria Harmast, who translated into to Polish for you folks, and for Barbara Parda and Diana Kirakowska, who translated into Polish Sign Language. Thank you very much for your hard job, and I guess I needed time to process all of it, and I guess many of us as well. So it's gonna be good, good time at the evening when we can make a sense for us personally and for our organizations, and takes those inspiration back home. Lena, I guess I give voice to you at the very end.
Thank you, Martina.
Thank you very much, and I will switch into Polish. Okej, mam nadzieję, że pani Maria tłumacząca już zdążyła się przełączyć. Słuchajcie, kilka słów na koniec ze strony organizacji organizującej, współorganizującej ten webinar, czyli Fundacji Herstory. Ja również dołączam się do naszych podziękowań, do Twoich podziękowań, Martyna. Dla mnie osobiście ten webinar był niesamowicie inspirujący i czuję jeszcze bardzo dużą potrzebę pogłębiania tych wątków, zwłaszcza, że teraz w Fundacji Herstory bardzo mocno stawiamy na włączanie mężczyzn i chłopców do tych działań równościowych. Właśnie projekt, który realizujemy, czyli SZTAMA w edukacji na rzecz zmiany, jest skierowany bezpośrednio do wsparcia edukacyjnego i do pracy z chłopcami. W tym momencie trwa pierwsza szkoła trenerska dla mężczyzn, którzy będą później pracować antyprzemocowo z chłopcami. Jestem super podekscytowana tym, jak będziemy się dalej rozwijać, więc jakoś Twoje wsparcie, Dean, i inspiracje, które nam tutaj przekazałeś, myślę, że długo zostaną z nami i będziemy chcieli i chciały jeszcze do nich wracać. I na tym myślę, że skończę takie kilka słów podsumowania. Dzięki bardzo dla Fundacji Ashoka za współorganizację, za tłumaczenie PJM, za prowadzenie. Tobie, Martyna, bardzo dziękuję. Dean, dla Ciebie szczególne podziękowania za wszystkie rzeczy, którymi chciałeś się z nami podzielić. I również zapraszam Państwa do obserwowania naszej strony na Facebooku, Fundacja Herstory oraz SZTAMA w edukacji na rzecz zmiany. Jeśli chcecie dalej obserwować i śledzić nasze poczynania związane z wsparciem chłopaków i pracą z mężczyznami, też zapraszam do zajrzenia do sieci MenEngage. Ja zdążyłam przepatrzeć YouTube'a MenEngage i Facebooka. Jest tam bardzo dużo interesujących treści, o których też, Dean, Ty wspominałeś, więc zapraszam Was. Zapraszam też do Fundacji Ashoka, tam też jest dużo fajnych treści w obszarze wsparcia i równości. We wrześniu będzie kolejny webinar, który też będziemy współorganizować z Fundacją Ashoka, z kolejnym ekspertem albo ekspertką, więc zapraszam po wakacjach i to wszystko. Dzięki bardzo. I oczywiście jeszcze raz mogę tylko podziękować Fundacji Batorego, ale też w ogóle całemu programowi z Funduszu Krajowego, dzięki któremu Aktywni Obywatele, dzięki którym w ogóle możemy zrealizować to działanie długofalowe. I w tym momencie myślę, że skończę już live stream na Facebooku, a następnie skończę w ogóle nasze nagranie i możemy zakończyć spotkanie, przejść do kuluarów. Dzięki bardzo.
There is a new man in South Africa.
A man who takes responsibility
For his actions.
A man who chooses a single partner
over multiple chances
with HIV.
A man whose self-worth is not determined by the number of women he can have.
There's a new man in South Africa.
A man who makes no excuses
for unprotected sex, even after drinking. A man who supports his partner
and protects his children.
A man who respects this woman and never lifts a hand to her.
A man who knows that the choices we make today
will determine whether we see tomorrow.
I am that man.
I am that man.
I am that man.
And you are my brother.
My father was not available at all. Like it's a ghost. My brother Andrew now is expecting his first child.
I'm gonna need his help with the baby. I'm gonna need him to be more understanding, to be more hands-on.
There are things that I'm nervous about. What kind of a father am I going to be?
Well, I'm worried that my brother Andrew might not be responsible enough. He started to mix with some gangsters around. This kind of attitude is going to take his life down the drain. Every time Andrew did this kind of bad things, I'm still thinking, what can I do to help him?
He told me that no, now you're old enough to have a baby, so I won't argue with that. I won't fight you for that. Only thing I'm gonna tell you, don't turn your back on your child. You must always be there for your child. You must love your child. That's what he told me.
The situation for women here is you're expected to go from work to being a mother at home and you don't get any assistance from your partner.
I'm a security guard. It's not like I like it there, but I'm just working because I don't want my kid to grow up like I did. It affects you. It does affect you.
I know tomorrow, maybe some of us will be the fathers of tomorrow. It means we have to change that mindset.
That situation whereby men get around together and address these issues, it can make our communities open up.
It's very good for Andrew to have someone like that so that he can see that that's what a man does. He stands up for his responsibilities and then he takes care of them. Andrew is changing, is growing. He's part of that generation, the generation that wants the family.
He's an inspiration to me. My dreams for being a father, to be a father like him.
Minha mãe, uma vez, quando ele bateu na porta, minha mãe abriu, ele estava alcoolizado, estava bêbado, e deu um soco. Tinha que mostrar que ele era homem.
mbese abanza kuvuga ati niba umwohereje ku ishuri kikaba ikindi kibazo, numva cya gikomere cyanjye kirazamutse.
පිරිමියාය මේම තමයි ඉන්න ඕනේ. ඒ කියන්නේ ගේනුගේ වැඩ කරන්න කොහොමත් අකමැත්තේනේ. ඒ වුණාට මට මම අම්බ කරලා දෙනවා. එයා ගෙදර ඉඳලා කරනවා. ඒ ඔක්කොම එයා බලාගයි.
Eu ficava dentro do meu quarto, digamos assim, trancado. Não, isso aqui ninguém mexe. A partir daquele momento ali, eu vendo a história de cada aquilo ali me serviu para que eu pudesse ser curado daquilo.
මට ඉස්සරලාම පොඩ්ඩක් ලැජ්ජ වුණා. මේ මාස 3ෙම ගියා වගේ. වෙන එකක් මගේ තුල එඟට ආවා වගේ දැනුණා.
ufite umukobwa we yimubuye buryo nyamara n'umukobwa wanjye nkumva ni ibintu nawe bimushimye kuba yarahindutse bifite umusaruro ushimishije.
Essa ferramenta é poderosa diante de uma comunidade de transformação. Ela não vem de um monte, ela vem pingo, 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 então torna aquele rio forte.
Baba ngiyacela ngicela wehlise umsindo uzovusa uThemba.
I'm the head of this house.
You didn't choose to be brought up in an abusive home.
Sexy lady. Hey, no one says no.
You didn't choose to grow up around men who harassed women.
Themba.
You didn't choose to be molested. None of those things were your choice. But raping her will be. You can't change your past, but you can choose the man you become.
I'm sorry.
Call us for free on this number if you need help. Brothers for Life. Yenzagal.